Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all having a good week. Happy Monday. Every Monday I go over my best of 1, best of 3 meta review for Standard. So we're on to week 5 of Foundations. And we've got some... we got a new archetype to talk about in best of 1, a couple of repeats, but a couple of changes, and then I will also be covering best of 3. So, I like to use the Untapped Tracker, which is a third-party tracker that you can download if you want to help support the channel. And so what this allows me to do is kind of remove my bias and just go off of what does the tracker say is the best deck from Bronze to Mythic. So this week we see still in number 1 in Tier 1 is Mono Red Aggro. The changes for this week, we've got 4 Lightning Strikes have been dropped for the 4 Monstrous Rages. Monstrous Rage tends to be better if there isn't as much single point interaction that can result in a 2-for-1, whereas the Lightning Strike is better against some of the mid-range matchups like Dimir and Golgari Midrange. And we're also dropping 1 Rockface Village for an additional mountain. And you can run into the issue of having too many Rockface Villages where you then can't cast your spells, like the Shock and the Monstrous Rage. So, I also like to cover the matchups in case you're new or returning to Magic the Gathering, so we'll just cover those really quickly. So Mono Red Aggro is favored against Dimir Midrange, Azorius Oculus, Mono Black Discard, Boros Burn, and Azorius Control. It's a coin flip against Golgari Midrange, Mono White Control, and it's weak against Mono Black Midrange, Boros Auras, and Rakdos Aggro. The other thing I like to do throughout the weeks is talk about what's the best cards to look for in your opening hand. And for Mono Red Aggro, you're looking for Heartfire Hero and Hired Claw. You definitely want to be starting on turn 1. Mardu Aggro has moved its way up to number 2 in Tier 1. And Tier 1 just means that they're statistically comparable. They're within the same standard deviation as far as their win rate. So Mardu Aggro is... so we're seeing a couple changes this week. We're dropping the Calisel Swords back down to 2 copies from 4, bringing in the 4th copy of the Emberheart Challenger, dropping a Demonic Ruckus, and then bringing in an additional Mountain and Plains. So bringing up the land count back up to 20, I believe. Yeah. And this deck is favored against Mono Red Aggro and Dimir Midrange. It's a coin flip against Boros Auras, largely being the same strategy as Boros Auras. And then it is weak against Mono Black Midrange, which can then get the 2-for-1 on your whatever you're targeting with your auras. The opening hand for Mardu Aggro is the same as Boros Auras, as you'll see, and that's a Heartfire Hero and Sheltered by Ghosts. All right, Boros Auras is number 3 in Tier 1, and we see a couple of changes this week that we haven't seen throughout the week. So dropping the Monastery Swiftspear, which is not uncommon to have that one kind of subbed out, and we're bringing in 1 copy of the Cheeky House Mouse, which has the Valiant synergies with the other Valiant Mice of Heartfire Hero and Emberheart Challenger. We're bringing up the Emberheart Challenger back up to 4 copies, and we're bringing in 1 copy of Kellen Planar Trailblazer, which can give you a late-game mana sink and a little bit of an option if you are flooding out. We're also bringing in 2 copies of the Screaming Nemesis. Usually we see this more in decks that can shoot your own Screaming Nemesis with like the Witchstalker's Frenzy or Shock or whatever to prevent your opponent from gaining life. But yeah, exploring it in Boros Auras this week. And to make room for this, we're dropping the Demonic Ruckus, and we're also tweaking the lands a little bit, dropping the 3 copies of Thran Portal to run a Mountain, a Plains, and an additional, or 1 copy of a Rockface Village. So little aspects of Mono Red being splashed in this week. Almost forgot. Okay, so Boros Auras is favored against Mono Red Aggro, Golgari Midrange, Azorius Oculus, and Boros Burn. It's a coin flip against Dimir Midrange and Mono White Control, and then it is weak to Mono Black Midrange, Azorius Control, especially Azorius Control because of the temporary lockdown. And then the opening hand is Heartfire Hero and Sheltered by Ghosts. Number 4 in Tier 2 is Selesnya Rabbits. And remember, this is Bronze to Mythic, so last week, Selesnya Rabbits was actually sitting at number 1 in Diamond, so it kind of depends on what meta is making up which section of the ladder. If you want to check it out, you can. You have to pay for it on the Untapped tracker, but if you want to just bug me about it and shoot me a message on Discord or leave a comment or whatever, I'll be happy to tell you what the tracker is saying. So number 4 at tier 2 is Selesnya Rabbits, and we're seeing the kind of change that we saw a couple of weeks ago where the Phineas Ace Archer is getting dropped down 1 copy to bring in a 3rd copy of the Warren War Leader. I've messed around with this archetype a couple of times, putting in like the Hinterland Sanctifier instead of the Warren taking out some of the cards to bring in Sheltered by Ghosts, and I think there's still room to kind of improve the Selesnya Rabbits build here. And we also see a more budget option in the lands, so this week the Brushland and the Razor Verge Thicket are getting dropped for just 4 forests and 4 plains. So Selesnya Rabbits is favored against Dimir Midrange and Golgari Midrange, really punishing the single point black interaction. It's a coin flip against mono black midrange and a coin flip against Azorius Control, and kind of depending on whether or not they get the sweeper out before you get the Knight Errant of Eos to rebuild. And then it's weak against mono red aggro and Boros Auras. Again, if you bring in the Sheltered by Ghosts, that kind of helps improve that matchup. That's why I was exploring it. The opening hand for this one is really the Valley Might Caller, the Paw Patch Recruit, and the Seasoned Warren. And if you are running at the Hinterland Sanctifier, they're okay, but they're not as good as the Valley Might Caller. And I'm not at the point where I'm like hard mulliganing to the Valley Might Caller, but I think that it's a reasonable strategy. Number 5 in tier 2, and by the way, tier 2 is completely viable to take to Mythic, well above a 50% win rate. And Rakdos Aggro is, number 5 at tier 2, and this week we see that they drop the Emberheart Challengers from the list entirely. Also dropping the Dreadmaw's Ire and the Turn Inside Out, which really help you get the Slickshot Show Off as a turn 3 win. And instead we're bringing in the Might of the Meek, which helps us draw and have a little bit longer of a game plan, as well as bringing in 2 shocks, which helped us in the mirror match, being able to shoot the Slickshot Show Off or the Manifold Mouse. And we're also dropping the Urbresk's Forge to bring in the 3 copies of the Mirror and Bane Splitter. And this one kind of, it allows you to, similar to the other combat tricks, but they last if the target doesn't get destroyed. And then we've got the 4 copies of the Demonic Ruckus. So just kind of an alternative, leaning a little bit more into the card draw, which helps if you are coming up against a lot of single point interaction and you need to go a little bit further down the line. So Rakdos Aggro is favored against mono red aggro, being usually a turn faster than the mono red strategy. It's a coin flip against Boros Auras, really comes down to whether or not they get the turn 2 Sheltered by Ghosts. And it's a coin flip against Golgari Midrange. It's weak against mono black midrange, Dimir Midrange, and Azorius Control. And the opening hand is Heartfire Hero, Heartfire Hero, Manifold Mouse if you're running it. This one's not. And Monastery Swiftspear. All right, number 6 is Mono Black Midrange, also in Tier 2. And we can see that we brought back the Liliana of the Veils at 2 copies here. Dropped 1 copy of the Archfiend of the Dross, and the 2 copies of Shieldred the Apocalypse, to bring in the 4th copy of the Bloodletter of Aclazotz, and dropped the Slasher down by 2. So this one leaning more heavily into the Bloodletter instead of the Slashers, and I went the other way for my Mono Black personally. And this one's also dropping the Rush of Dread, which is kind of a combo with the Bloodletter of Aclazotz. I really like the Rush of Dread, but again, I'm trying to remove my bias by using the tracker. So we've gone up to a 4th copy of Duress here, as well as a full playset of Cut Down, and bringing in 1 copy of Nowhere to Run, which helps out against the ward on Sheltered by Ghosts. And we're also dropping the 2 Cavern of Souls and a Fountain Port to just bring in 2 swamps, and choosing the Manland of Mishra's Foundry instead of the Soulstone Sanctuary. Soulstone Sanctuary does have the synergies with the Unholy Annex, but there is something to be said about the cheap activation of Mishra's Foundry. So Mono Black Midrange is pretty well set up in the meta right now because it is good against Mono Red Aggro and Boros Auras. It's also good against Golgari Midrange, Mono Black Discard, and Boros Burn. It's a coin flip against Azorius Control, and it's weak against Dimir Midrange, Azorius Oculus, and Mono White Control. And the opening hand mid-range decks don't need to mulligan as heavily as an aggro deck does, so do keep that in mind. But you are looking for Unstoppable Slasher, Unholy Annex, and cheap interaction like Cut Down. All right, number 7 is Jeskai Convoke, and this one's the new archetype. So we talked a lot about Jeskai Convoke prior to rotation, back when we had Voldaren Epicure, which allowed this to be just Boros Convoke. Since we lost the Voldaren Epicure, we've seen a couple of different explorations. One is the Clockwork Percussionist coming in instead of the Yoshin Frontliner, and the Spyglass Siren is the reason why we're bringing in blue for the Spyglass Siren, so that we have a map token on turn 1. That kind of replaces the Voldaren Epicure, with the downside of having to run a less consistent mana base, right? But the strategy is still the same. You're looking to turn 1, create a token, either a map token or a clue token. Turn 2, you're trying to play another creature and then Gleeful Demolition that token, so that you can then convoke your Knight Errant of Eos on turn 2. To play this out, and ideally hit your Imidane's Recruiter in the draw off of your Knight Errant of Eos, and then turn 3 swing in for a whole bunch of damage. Now, more consistently in practice, this usually is Imidane's Recruiter usually comes down on turn 4. You can get that through doing the Resolute Reinforcements. You don't even have to do the Gleeful Demolition. The interaction for the deck is Case of the Gateway Express, which takes advantage of the go wide, and then you have Sheltered by Ghosts, which helps you against the red matchups that can be problematic for this deck. This deck really punishing the single point interaction, but struggling a little bit against the... it has a lack of instant speed interaction for the mono-red strategies. So this one is relatively new to Best of 1 for Foundations, so there's not very much as far as the matchup data goes, but I do expect it to be weak against mono red and better against like mono black, just from prior to rotation. And then the opening hand for this one, you're really looking for Gleeful Demolition and your early token generators like Spyglass Siren and Novice Inspector. And Sheltered by Ghosts is not a bad one to have because it is the stabilizing force to help out against mono red. And mono red is a pretty prevalent matchup on the Best of 1 ladder. And the 8th archetype in, so number 8 here in Tier 2 is Mono White Lifegain. And if we compare this one to last week, we still see no changes. So I was surprised to see the Leyline kind of being removed. What was it? The Leyline of Hope. I liked it personally in my build, but it does kind of have that hit and miss quality of Leylines being better in your opening hand and then dead cards later. Cat Collector, I think, is a really great one that it's not in every single mono white Lifegain list that I see. I like dropping the Queen, the triple pip white that gains a life every time a white creature attacks. So I like the direction in a lot of ways. I'm not 100% sold on Case of the Uneaten Feast as a way to kind of, just personally, I haven't been super impressed with this card. But again, trying to remove my bias. Not doing a great job this week. So anyway, this one's favored against Mono Red Aggro and Boros Auras, and Coin Flip against Mono Black Midrange, Golgari Midrange, and it's weak against Dimir Midrange. The opening hand is cards like the Cat Collector does particularly well. Leyline of Hope if you are running it, the Leonin Vanguard, which isn't in this list as well. It's the one that gets, if you have 3 creatures, it gains a life and gets +1/+1, which kind of triggers the creature growing, like the Pridemate and the Channeler growing pre-combat. And then Hinterland Sanctifier, if you are running that one as well. And then the cards that grow, like the Essence Channeler and the Pridemate. So, basically like the whole deck, right? And the Enduring Innocence in here, I've seen in some, it works particularly well with the 1/1s that are spawning off of the Cat Collector. All right, the other thing I like to do is Best of 3, and I like to use the standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online. And so we'll just be talking about the number 1 and number 2 decks throughout the weeks. If you do want more of a kind of tier of several tournaments and things like that, I highly recommend MTG Rebellion. I'm a big fan of their podcast that they do, I think, every Wednesday. Anyway, so this one's Dimir Midrange by MJ23. Took down first place on Friday the 13th. And we've talked about Dimir Midrange a lot throughout the weeks. It's doing very well right now in the meta. It's a very popular pick on the arena ladder as well. This one's dropping the Mockingbirds. The Mockingbirds have the downside of trying to copy something that gets destroyed with a single point interaction. We're bringing in one additional copy of Anoint with Affliction. This one particularly good for eliminating slashers, Mosswood Dread Knights, any problematic sticky threat that's 3 or less. And we're bringing in, or taking out the 2 copies of the Go for the Throat and bringing in the Sheoldred's Edict. This one, I think it was because we see a little bit of a rise in Boros Auras or Boros Prowess that's running like the Sheltered by Ghosts. Not, so that you can then get around that by making them sacrifice. It's also really good against other Dimir Midrange running the Kaidos, right? Giving you some Planeswalker hate. So we're dropping 1 Swamp to bring in a Restless Reef and a Soulstone Sanctuary, so going up a land this week. And the best of 3 sideboard, we're dropping the Anoint with Affliction, the 2 Blotouts, the Disfigure, the Negate, and Sheoldred the Apocalypse to bring in 2 copies of Akelzot's Deepest Betrayal. This one's really good to stabilize against aggro matchups. Ghost Vacuum is really good for hating on your opponent's graveyard, so really good against Azorius Oculus. It's also really good against Enduring Curiosity and the Enduring green one in Temur Otters or Temur Prowess. Any of these that when they go to the graveyard, it returns to the battlefield. It does go into the graveyard when it dies, so you can Ghost Vacuum it before it has the opportunity to come back, right? So Ghost Vacuum works particularly well in the mirror match as well. And I did do a full sideboard guide for Dimir. If you want to check that out in the community tab, it is available. And we're also running an additional copy of Gix's Command, so 2 copies of Gix's Command. This one good at destroying the go wide strategies, and we are seeing a little bit more of Jeskai Convoke coming into the best of 3 ladder. And then the full playset of Preacher of the Schism in the sideboard. And we're starting to see more and more Sheoldred, the Apocalypse, and Preacher of the Schism being brought into the sideboard instead of into the main, and that largely has to do with the meta happening in the global standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online. So you're going to want to tweak this to whatever meta you're experiencing in your tournaments or on the arena ladder. Preacher of the Schism and Sheoldred the Apocalypse are doing particularly well against aggro, and aggro being kind of favored because of how quickly you can play those matches on the arena ladder. You might want to play these in the main if you're climbing the ladder, is what I'm getting at. And this one, the strategy is favored against Golgari Midrange. It's a coin flip against Mono White Control and Domain and Mono Red Aggro and Simic Beanstalk and Boros Prowess. Again, this is largely dependent on how you are sideboarding. And then it is weak against Gruul Prowess, Jeskai Convoke, and Azorius Artifacts. And the Azorius Artifacts is the one that's running the Leyline Axe, not the old one with the Simulacrum. Second place on Friday the 13th was taken down by Gruul Prowess by L1X0, and we can see kind of a couple of changes here. So sometimes this one gets referred to as mono red because it can be a fully red main board with just the green cards in the sideboard. This one's dropping 2 copies of the Screaming Nemesis to bring in the 3 copies of the Questing Druid and 2 copies of the Obliterating Bolt. Again, this one's better against like the Enduring Curiosity, problematic threats that keep coming back. It's pretty decent against Azorius Oculus too. And we're dropping the 4 copies of the Lightning Strike as well as the 3 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy and bringing in a Scorching Dragonfire. And the Scorching Dragonfire gives you that exile as well, but it also has the ability to shoot Planeswalkers like Kaido. And we've also brought in the 2 copies of the Snakeskin Veil, so leaning more into your typical like Gruul main board instead of just mono red. And then we're changing the lands to reflect that by dropping the 3 mountains and the 2 rock face villages to bring in the 3 Carplusian forests and the 3 soulstone sanctuaries. So the best of 3 sideboard also got a rework, so we're dropping 1 Pop Hatch formation. This one's particularly good against the Unholy Annex, being able to kill either the flyer or the enchantment itself. It's pretty decent against Domain as well for being able to pop up the Beanstalk or Atraxa. And Questing Druid, this one, we're taking down 1 Questing Druid because we're bringing it into the main. This one, you're going to sideboard this in when you're up against mid-range and control, where you can take the time to seek the beast. It's worse off against other aggro matchups. Usually you sideboard out your questing druids. Torch the Tower is particularly nice against the other aggro builds. Usually want to bring these in if you're up against the Mirror Match, Dimir Midrange, Mono Red Aggro, that sort of thing. Twisted Fealty getting dropped from this deck, and you've got the Paw Patch formations to answer the demons anyway, so I'm not really sure that we need to take their 6/6 and then hit them with the Twisted Fealty. But we've seen that one kind of come and go throughout the weeks. And Lithomatic Barrage making its way back in. And so this one's good against like Zur in Domain. It's good against Azorius Oculus with the white-blue. Basically, if you've got a white or blue target, you're going to bring in the Lithomatic Barrage. One Scorching Shot, this helps out against the 5 toughness creatures like Shieldred. And Tectonic Hazard is the cheap sweeper for if you're coming up against Jeskai Convoke or Mono White Control. The tokens you can kind of wipe with a cheap sweeper as well. So Gruul Prowess is favored against Dimir Midrange and Domain, and it's weak against Golgari Midrange and Mono Red Aggro. First place on Saturday the 14th was taken down by Boros Prowess by Lost Wanderer. And we have to go back to week 3 to compare the list, but we can see that they took a slightly different direction. So they dropped the Kellen Planar Trailblazer, the 4 copies of Optimistic Scavenger, and the 4 copies of the Spellbook Vendor, which is more of like the Boros Auras approach, this one being a little bit more prowessy, if you will, because we're bringing in the 4 copies of the Hired Claw, which we see in Mono Red. We're bringing in Mabel, which is a good way to kind of trigger the Valiant of Heartfire Hero and Emberheart Challenger with the equipment that it creates. And we're bringing in 2 copies of Screaming Nemesis and the 2 copies of the Boros Charm. And that's why I think kind of call this one Boros Prowess. I'm just, maybe that's my own personal preference. But anyway, being able to give something double strike, it gives you additional triggers that can burst for a ton of damage. And we're bringing the Burst Lightning up to 4 and dropping the Demonic Ruckus, as well as 1 copy of Shard Mage's Rescue, which is kind of like the white version of Snakeskin Veil. We're dropping 2 copies of the Sheltered by Ghosts and taking out 2 planes to bring in a Rockish Carnival and the 2 copies of the Rockface Village. So still seeing some aspects of Mono Red influencing into this archetype. And we also see a rework in the best of 3 sideboard. So we've dropped the Case of the Crimson Pulse and the Lightning Helix and 1 Torch the Tower to bring in Exercise. And this one is particularly good if you're coming up against Artifact and Enchantments, but also able to kill creatures with power 4 or greater, which is kind of like its counterpart. Destroy Evil doesn't hit artifacts, but allows you to destroy creatures with toughness 4 or greater. So you're going to want to bring these in if you are coming up against the Preacher of the Schism in Dimir Midrange, for example. And then we have 2 copies of Rest in Peace. This one for the Graveyard Reanimator strategies, as well as Azorius Oculus. We've got 1 additional Screaming Nemesis if you're coming up against other red decks. The Screaming Nemesis is usually a 2-for-1. A little bit worse against the mono black if they have like Go for the Throat. And then we have a 3rd copy of Sheltered by Ghosts, depending on whether or not they have single point interaction that would punish trying to get the Sheltered by Ghosts down, or if they have the edicts and such, like, nowhere to run, etc. Right? But this can be particularly nice and stabilizing against other aggro matchups. So the Boros Prowess strategy is favored against Domain. It's a coin flip against Dimir Midrange and Mono Red Aggro, and is weak against Golgari Midrange. All right, number 2 is Domain by Logo299. Went number 2 on Saturday. We're dropping 1 Overlord of the Flood Pits, which is the blue one, for 1 Overlord of the Mistmoors, which is the white one. We're dropping Herd Migration from the list entirely and bringing in the 2 copies of Analyze the Pollen. And I kind of like this because it's almost like this deck is playing a little bit more towards the combo side of combo control than we have seen in the past, especially with trying to find your Zur internal schemers, right? So Analyze the Pollen allows you to collect evidence and go search your library and tutor for a specific creature card, so you can kind of like play additional copies of Zur. And so I really like the inclusion here, and that's why I made it the deck captain, if you will, for this week's episode. The best of 3 sideboard is dropping the Chrome Host Sea Sharks and the Doppelgang as well as Kaya Intangible Slayer, and 2 copies of Pop Hatch Formation to bring in 2 copies of Nissa Ascended Animist. Again, this is good against the Wraths like White Sunfalls, anything that kind of has the sweeper effect, doesn't attack Planeswalkers. It's also really good against the artifact and enchantment heavy decks, can be brought in against the Caretaker's Talent and the Unholy Annex. And then it gives you an overrun effect as well. And then we also have an additional copy, or 2 copies of Terra Sunder for artifact and enchantment hate as well. And then 1 Tranquil Frillback, which gives you artifact and enchantment hate as well as graveyard hate and life stabilization. So really leaning into being able to answer all of the other enchantments, particularly nice if you're coming up or anticipating a lot of other domain running a bunch of enchantments. So this deck is favored against Golgari Midrange. It's a coin flip against Dimir Midrange, and that one's kind of a shift because Zur changes its matchups from its original build. And it's weak against Gruul Prowess and Mono Red Aggro, still struggling against a little bit of the early aggression. Number 1 on Saturday, because there are 2 tournaments, is Dimir Midrange by Happy 1-2 or Happy 12. And if we also compare this one to last week, we can see they dropped 1 Kaido Bane of Nightmares. Most lists I've been seeing have been deciding to run the full playset and lean fully into the aggro of playing Kaido off of an early flyer. This one's also dropping the Mockingbird and dropping the 2 Tishana's Tidebinders. That one's matchup dependent. It's particularly good against Domain to silence the enchantments. It actually has a fair amount of stuff that it's pretty good at hitting in the meta right now. Silencing Kaido, that sort of thing. Because even though Kaido has hexproof, you're not targeting Kaido, you're targeting its ability, which then silences Kaido. It's a way to get around ward as well, so just keep that in mind. We're bringing in 2 copies of Deep Cavern Bat. This one kind of pulled out for a little while, was kind of considered core at one point in time in the archetype, but it fits the theme of cheap evasive flyers that you're then going to convert into card draw off of Enduring Curiosity. And we also have the 3 copies of Preacher of the Schism in the main instead of in the sideboard. Again, kind of just depending on whether or not you anticipate coming up against Gruul Prowess and Mono Red Aggro or not. And then we're not running the 2 copies of the Fabloon Trick, which was the tap a creature, create 2/1/1 flyers that I really like. We're running the Phantom Interference instead of the Spell Stutter, and we're running a Nowhere to Run. So both running the single copy of the Nowhere to Run. And then we're dropping 1 Swamp to bring in a Restless Reef and the Soulstone Sanctuary, just like the other list. And as far as the sideboard goes, we're dropping 1 Anoint with Affliction and 2 Blotouts and the 2 Preacher of the Schisms and the Shieldred the Apocalypse to bring in a Disdainful Stroke. This one's good against Domain because if they play the enchantments for their impending cost, they count as mana value higher than their impending cost, right? So it's particularly nice against that matchup. The 2 copies of the Ghost Vacuum, like I mentioned, are good against Dimir Midrange, as well as Azorius Oculus or any graveyard-dependent strategy. Anything that's running one of the enduring things, so good against Temur Prowess as well. Gix's Command is good as a sweeper against the go-wide strategies. The Lifelink can also help stabilize in certain matchups. The 3 Steps Ahead is good if you have time to cast it. better in the slower matchups. And then Tishana's Tidebinder, like I mentioned, if they have a interesting Planeswalker or something with a triggered or activated ability, then you can bring in the Tishana's Tidebinder. Generally, you don't want to bring these in against Mono Red because of the poor stat line of a 3/2. Gets really punished by the Burst Lightnings. All right, so second place on Saturday was taken down by Gruul Prowess by L1X0, and the only change that they made to their list on Friday was dropping 1 Monastery Swiftspear for a Scorching Dragonfire, so running 2 Scorching Dragonfires. Other than that, they didn't change anything to the sideboard, so we won't be covering it. We'll just skip over that one this week. And on to Sunday's tournament, which is the biggest tournament of the week, and Temur Prowess by Just Alice took down number 1. Temur Prowess is one that's particularly difficult to navigate. It's a combo deck, so the better that the better that you are able to navigate the combo, the better that you're going to perform with it. And I think the average person, bronze to mythic on the arena ladder, struggles to really make this deck shine. But we did see this one in the top 2 back in week 3, so it definitely is a viable meta deck. This one is bringing in the Invasion of Tarkir, which gives you kind of removal and then an alternative win condition through the Defiant Thundermaw. Questing Druid bringing in... They took this deck in a couple of different ways that I really like. So this is kind of like digging a little bit better for your combo, right? So the Seek the Beast side of it helps you dig into and enable your combo. We're dropping the 4 copies of the Sleight of Hand, which is leaning further away from the Prowess side of things in this deck and more towards the combo side of things. So it might be better to call this Temur Combo. I see some people call it the Floodcaller Combo, because you are centered around this card specifically. Let's see. So we're bringing in the 3 copies of the Analyze the Pollen, and this is another reason why it's the deck captain this week, is that moving this more towards, like, treating this more like a combo deck, just like Domain, helping you find your pieces with Analyze the Pollen, I think is a really good inclusion and is a really good fit for this deck, right? So, like, increasing the ways that we can kind of dig better than the Sleight of Hands. And then running an additional Song of Totentons, so we don't have to go find the 1 copy in our deck. Bringing in 1 Burst Lightning. I think this is really just to help out against the Mono Red Aggro and Gruul Prowess, which this deck really struggles against. And we're running 1 copy of the Paw Patch Formation, which helps out against the Mono Black. And I lost my spot, sorry. We're dropping 1 Roaring Furnace, Steaming Sauna to make room for it, as well as dropping 1 up the Beanstalk. And then we're tweaking the lands a little bit, dropping the Spire Bluff Canal and the Yavmea Coast to bring in a Carplusion Forest and the Tarnation Vista. And I think we saw this one last week? Maybe not. Tarnation Vista allows you to tap for a ton of mana. So you get for each color among mono-colored permanents you control, add 1 mana of that color. And so you can tap it for more mana than it's actually worth. So best of 3 sideboard, and yeah, I'm assuming this week a little bit that you guys have already kind of heard everything since we're into week 5. This plays a lot like the Jeskai Ascendancy deck from times gone by. The best of 3 sideboard is dropping the Disdainful Strokes and the Flood Pits Drowner, the Paw Patch Formation, and Ral Crackling Wit, as well as the 3 copies of the Screaming Nemesis. Again, this is just kind of meta-dependent. The Screaming Nemesis is good against, like, Mono Red. The Flood Pits Drowner, I think, was being explored to see if it could kind of slow things down so that you could pull off your combo. Disdainful Stroke is good against Domain, etc. So this one's bringing in Aegis Turtle, which is definitely a new one, but is something that really slows things down, and I think probably slows things down better than the Flood Pits Drowner actually does. So you're going to bring this in against the early aggro decks. Curious to see how this one plays, right? We're bringing Bitter Reunion is another one too that can kind of help us dig, and this one I think was a spicy one. I don't think this was one that you're really going to see all that often, right? So Hitsugu's Second Right allows you to deal 10 damage if your opponent is exactly at 10 life. So it's a way to kind of surprise your opponent, right? It's a cheeky win. Into the Floodmaw helps up against the early aggro decks like Mono Red Aggro and Gruul Prowess. And Negate allows you to counter things like the Unholy Annex on 3 instead of Disdainful Stroke, which then has to hit targets that are more expensive. So this one has like pros and cons to the Disdainful Stroke, and I'm not surprised to see the Negate here. Pyroclasm is this pilot's choice for answering the Jeskai Convoke strategies and the mono white tokens. I like this a lot more than I like the Tectonic Blast. It's a little bit more expensive, but in a deck that has more mana than the cheaper strategies, then Pyroclasm is good because Jeskai Convoke can be running War Leader's Call and get out of range, although I guess that was more common prior to rotation. So this one's also running 2 copies of Scavenging Ooze as its choice for Graveyard Hate, and 2 copies of Song of Totentons. And I'm not actually sure. I don't have enough time with this deck to actually tell you when you would want to bring in 4 copies of the Song of Totentons. But that option is available. And so this deck is favored against Golgari Midrange, Mono White Control. It's a coin flip against Dimir Midrange and Domain, and it's weak against Mono Red Aggro and Gruul Prowess. And the last deck that we're going to talk about today is Golgari Midrange by Vitor Carvalho. I was always calling you Victor Carvalho. I apologize. I believe it's Vitor Carvalho 01. Took down number 2 on Sunday. And always got to have a little nod to the rock, right? Golgari Midrange. So we're dropping the Vivian Reed from the main. Again, that one's kind of dependent on how much other demon strategies off of the Unholy Annex you're going to be bumping into. We're also dropping Preacher of the Schism and dropping the Sentinel of the Nameless City and kind of trimming down the 3 drops that we saw from last week, right? We're also dropping the Swarm Weaver and we're bringing in the Scavenging Ooze. Sorry, I'm getting a little slow here. Bringing in the 2 copies of Thrun, Breaker of Silence, which we saw in the sideboard of 1 last week and then in the main of 1 last week as well. And particularly good at punishing the non-green strategies, right? And we're taking out the Duress from the main and bringing in the Gix's Command. Again, largely just dependent on what you anticipate in the meta. This is better against the aggro and the go wide strategies than it is against just strictly control. And then Anoint with Affliction, again, for problematic threats that you want to exile. And then 1 copy of The End. Oh, no, okay, there it is. All right, so 1 copy of The End. So we're dropping the Unholy Annexes from this list, and so leaning totally away from the demon strategy and leaning more just like back in the good old Golgari days, right? So the End is really good at pinpoint, kind of like a pithing needle effect. You can remove a creature or planeswalker and then get rid of it entirely from the game. So better if you're up against a strategy that's like Domain, get rid of Zur. That really hurts their strategy, for example, right? And then the best of 3... Oh, wait. Whew, okay, I'm starting to lose my spot. Yeah, so to make room for this, we're dropping Nowhere to Run, a Forest, and we're bringing in a Soulstone Sanctuary and a Swamp. The best of 3 sideboard, we're dropping Anoint with Affliction, Choking Miasma, Gix's Command, Liliana, Dreadhorde General, Thrun, Breaker of Silence, and Vivian Reed. And we're bringing in the Cut Down, 1 copy of Duress. So Cut Down, you're going to bring in against aggro matchups. Duress, you're going to bring in against control. 3 copies of Harvester of Misery for mono-white tokens and for Jeskai Convoke. And then 2 copies of Nissa Ascended Animus. This one's going to be good against like Domain, anything that has an important artifact or an enchantment. So Urbrask's Forge in mono red. You're going to bring this in against the Caretaker's Talent in mono white, etc. And then we also have a 2nd copy of The End if you're coming up against a deck that is more of a combo deck, right? So really like Temur Prowess or Floodcaller Combo and Domain, right? And this strategy, Golgari Midrange, tends to be better against the more aggro matchups like mono red aggro. More of a coin flip against Gruul Prowess, kind of depends on whether or not they hit the cheeky Snakeskin Veil at the right time and how good your opponent is at piloting around your mini answers. And then it's weak against Dimir Midrange and Domain. This deck really struggles against the Sunfall. So thanks for listening to my ramblings, and hope you have a wonderful week. Good luck crushing the ladder. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me in the comments below. And I will be back on Sunday, probably. My schedule is pretty crazy this week, and I'm exhausted, so may or may not actually get to the Meta Breakers on Sunday, but I will do my best. And yeah, so take care, everybody. Have a good one.